the laser industry specifically.
It has changed dramatically.
The field of biophotonics was just getting started.
The first instrument that I bought was a microwave spectrum analyzer.
It's time to shed light on our universe. This is All Things Photonics, a podcast about the physical science of light. Join us as we explore the latest in lasers, optics, spectroscopy, and microscopy. Each episode, you'll hear from leading voices from across the photonics landscape. We're brought to you by Photonics Media.
This is Associate Editor Joel Williams. Here are this week's top stories. Researchers from Nagoya University and the Technical University of Darmstadt developed a method to quantitatively study the effect of light on nanoscale mechanical properties of crystalline materials such as thin wafer semiconductors. This method, referred to as photoindentation, uses a tiny pointed probe to indent the material while it is illuminated by a light source to observe the effect of light at different wavelengths on dislocation, nucleation, and mobility. A transparent glass display with a high white light contrast ratio is able to smoothly transition through a broad spectrum of color when stimulated with electricity. The technology, developed by researchers at Jilin University, overcomes hurdles that face existing electrochromic devices by capitalizing on the interactions between metal ions and ligands. Researchers from the University of Technology, Sydney, developed a technique based on principles of optical tweezing to allow them to manipulate particles possessing the same refractive properties as those of the background environment in a given setting. The method, shown as a proof of concept, dopes nanocrystals with rare earth metal ions and uses less energy to trap nanoparticles without sacrificing efficiency. A microchrome developed by researchers from Chalmers University of Technology has the potential to herald significant advances in a variety of technologies spanning metrology and optical communication. The design, which uses two microresonators, is coherent, tunable, and reproducible, and has up to 10 times higher net conversion efficiency than current state-of-the-art devices. And finally, researchers from Tomsk Polytechnic University, along with international collaborators, have formulated a method allowing for a laser-driven integration of metals into polymers to form electrically conductive composites. The method uses laser pulses to irradiate aluminum nanoparticles on polyethylene terephthalate substrates to form electrically conductive composites. The work has implications for flexible electronics. Up next, news editor Jake Saltzman is joined by Fulbright scholar and former president of the Optical Society, Ursula Gibson. Later, Jake speaks with Nick Harris, founder and CEO of Lightmatter. I'm Joel Williams, and you're listening to All Things Photonics.
Today's episode is sponsored by COMSOL, the leading developer of multiphysics simulation software, which includes tools for building and deploying simulation apps. COMSOL's wave and ray optics capabilities are used for modeling, imaging, and sensing in consumer electronics and biotechnology, information processing and communication systems, and more. See how the COMSOL software fits your optical analysis needs at www.comsol.com.
We're joined today on All Things Photonics by Dr. Ursula Gibson. Dr. Gibson is a Fulbright scholar, receiving her scholarship in 2008, and she has held visiting positions around the world at the U.S. Air Force Academy, NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, Tampere University of Technology in Finland, Chalmers University in Sweden, and the University of Queensland in Australia. She served as president of the Optical Society in 2019, and she joins us today from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, where she serves as a professor of physics. Hello, Ursula.
Hi. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. This is going to be interesting.
I hope so. And I wanted to start off, in the intro, we mentioned some of the prestigious locations that have hosted you and where your work has commenced from. So I want to ask you right off the bat about geography and the ability to work in so many distinct settings and environments. How has that influenced your work through your career?
I think that all the different places that I have been is perhaps a genetic thing, that my parents had both traveled quite a bit even when they were young, and they took us when they went on sabbatical. We went to different countries in Europe and even went to the U.S. once. And I think it sort of rubbed off on me. But, how has it affected my work? I think that the exposure to and appreciation for different cultures, it's really broadened my understanding of how many different ways there are to contribute to science. So brilliance is just one vein of what is needed. Meticulous follow-up, unconventional approaches, different blends of formalism and intuition, they can all combine. And so I think the sort of social exposure to different cultures may perhaps realize how important it is to be open to different cultures within science.
Was the desire to live and work in so many different locations, and we're not just talking North America and Europe. We mentioned Australia, among other locations. I'm just wondering if the desire to travel was a conscious identification for you, or was it something that perhaps arose organically?
Much more organic than planned. I really wouldn't say that the breadth of my travels was by design. Most of it was due to, willingness to explore. An opportunity would come up and I'd go yes before I thought about it, and then find myself in a fabulous environment, learning new things and meeting new people. And I have to say that one of the leading things has been the kindness of colleagues with their invitations to let me come visit.
Much of our conversation today, I'm sure, will involve optical fibers and hollow core optical fibers and a lot of the areas in which technology is moving rapidly. The fiber-dependent method that you developed for solar energy-generated electricity supports numerous applications, and it's even allowed you to form a company for the manufacture of silicon solar cell threads. Can you give us a nuts and bolts of that method?
Yeah, so I would love to claim responsibility for it, but the actual how to make the fibers was something that came out of Clemson University, John Bellotto's group, that they had learned how to take silicon, put it into a glass matrix, and draw it into fiber form, where you can decide how big it's going to be in diameter. Now, when they did that, they had some problems, and my group was actually able to solve one of the problems that they'd had. So it's really been a collaboration, that we had this little technique and we visited them and said, hey, could you try this? And they're like, oh, wow, we'd love to try that. And we've been working together ever since. But the technique really is that you take a conventional glass preform of the sort that's used to make optical fibers, but instead of depositing a layer of glass that has a near refractive index that's close to what the outside is, you put a lump of semiconductor in the middle and you take it up to temperature where the semiconductor melts. But then when you draw the glass down, the semiconductor is forced, it's as if the glass is a crucible, and it draws the silicon down into a very fine thread. We've drawn fibers directly with cores down to just a few microns. But for the solar cells, you want something that absorbs more. So they also draw what they call cane, which might have a glass outer diameter of a millimeter or so, and then an inner core about 1/10 of that.
You've mentioned how your work with semiconductor core optical fibers has opened doors for you to work in numerous areas and applications beyond solar cells and photovoltaics, for example. What are some of those applications that your current work is exploring?
Again, I have to acknowledge colleagues that Anna Peacock's group at Southampton has been doing incredible work on the optical front. They've looked at nonlinear optics, infrared continuum generation, four-wave mixing, all sorts of exciting things. And if I've understood it correctly, there's some ideas bouncing around for generating entangled photon pairs. So kind of getting to the quantum arena. And recently, I was contacted by some researchers in the gravity wave community. The next generation of interferometers is being planned around cryogenic mirrors, and single crystal silicon is one of the top candidates for how you suspend these. And that is something they saw one of my papers and thought, hey, maybe we should talk. And so I was able to get a short experience in that community at one of their conferences, and wow, what an eye-opener. That planning for the next gravity wave interferometer is a huge endeavor.
Absolutely, it is. We're speaking with Dr. Ursula Gibson here on All Things Photonics. Let's take a step back, and I want to ask you about your introduction to optics. Who or what led you to the field?
Again, maybe a trifle of serendipity. I started out my undergraduate research experience in superconductivity, and then I had an opportunity to go to Bell Labs, but I ended up in my first year there working with somebody, Eric Ippen, who introduced me to sort of optical material properties, and I got quite interested in it. And so when I went on to grad school, my advisor had parallel programs, if you can believe it, this in superconductivity and in solar energy materials. And I started out thinking I was going to do the superconductivity thing, but I switched to the optical materials, and I've enjoyed it ever since.
Your career has spanned not only various and vast locations, but also various and vast technologies. At this point now, you talk about interferometry, you talk about quantum. Do you continue to be surprised and amazed by some of the connections, that some of the applications that have been on your radar for decades are now finding new homes, for lack of a better term, and new applications?
I have this sort of rule of thumb that technology goes in cycles of a sort, that, somebody has an idea and they can't quite do it because the technology isn't in place, perhaps, but they talk about the idea, and then 40 years later, somebody else needs that for something else. And so there's this beautiful cycle of sort of materials development and technology development. So I'm not overall surprised that there are cool new things happening, but I have to say it's a lifelong enjoyment of how it can just continue to be new and exciting.
And through the course of your career, you've been able to, no doubt, witness firsthand the comings and also the goings of many trends in many areas. In terms of 2D materials, the photonics community's infatuation with graphene, for example, seems to have given way to silicon. And we've had conversations on the podcast with McCall Lipson and others about the state of silicon photonics. How has the evolution of materials influenced your areas of interest?
In some way, I think I have, I was around when high TC superconductors sort of flattened the scientific community. There was the Woodstock of physics where everybody went, and I got a real taste of the excitement therein, but also the sort of conservatism that came afterwards when it really didn't quite play into as big a thing as people expected. And when fullerenes came along, I said, not for me, not going near it. And I hate to say it, but graphene has been another of those things where there is a community that is tied directly to it. And I feel that as an outsider looking in, leaping into the fray is not my style. So I'm thrilled that silicon is coming back into play, and very excited that some of the things that we're playing with in my lab, I think, will have an influence on 2D silicon photonics going forward.
I have to ask, now that the door has opened itself here, what is going on in your lab?
Oh, okay. So kind of all sorts of things. But we are learning to recrystallize these silicon fibers. So I guess I should step back a bit and say that we're working with semiconductor core fibers and have put a lot of effort into silicon. And silicon by itself is a little tricky because it wants to be polycrystalline. And so at least in the large sizes that you might like to deal with, you have to be a little clever about how to crystallize it. And one of the things that we found out is that by introducing another element, we can get a handle on the recrystallization of silicon over long distances. And we're working now with different material systems. Now that we got into the alloy space, the periodic table is our playground. Look out.
It's funny that we talk about not just silicon, but materials in this vein. It's something new for us. I'm cognizant of the fact that much of our Photonic Spectrum magazine content really aims to appeal to who we identify as the end users of photonic technologies. But in doing so, we can omit the story of some of the research or even the manufacture of certain devices or components. I'll use the example in covering photovoltaics. We might be inclined to ask, well, what does an end user need to know before implementing this technology or this product? I want to ask you, from your position in your research, what type of consideration are you giving to a potential end user? Is that even a consideration in the research stage?
I fundamentally would like to make something that's useful. So when I write my proposal, I'm not kidding when I say that I think that this can be used for this, that, or the other. And, so every program that I have has some sort of a goal, whether it's transmission of terahertz for potential surgery or medical diagnostic purposes, or whether it's making a light source inside a fiber, or a detector inside a fiber. There is an end user in mind, but at the same time, I recognize that if I commit myself to sort of being product oriented, that I may not take advantage of my true skills, which are more in sort of primary materials development and materials processing.
I mentioned in the intro that your work with a fiber-dependent method for solar energy-generated electricity has enabled you to at least dabble in the production side of things. And this is a theme with many of today's scientists working not just in research and academia, but also in industry. And I'm curious how that position, being able to get some industry experience or familiarity, has helped grow or evolve your appreciation for the science.
I think that probably the biggest impact has been to recognize how ignorant I am of the commercial world and the importance of bringing together a diversified group to discuss this. That, if you get a little knot of scientists together and talk about a product, maybe none of them has ever done anything in the commercial world. And so broadening the network and connecting with people who have experience in tech transfer is incredibly important. And I've gained a real appreciation for not only the tech transfer people, but the incredible talents of the people who take a tech idea and launch a company. Wow, that's a big step.
Much of your work, especially recently, as we've discussed, has involved silicon and silicon core optical fibers. And we've talked about industry, and we've talked about devices and components and end users. I want to make sure we cover all our bases here and bring up the supply chain. What type of attention do you pay on the research side to the supply chain of some of the elements, materials, and components with which you work?
I am a believer that what we are doing is actually a really good potential route for but at least limiting the arrival time of problems of that sort. So if we want to make a semiconductor device, we put the material into this glass form and then we draw it down into a fiber, and we really don't throw away much of the material at all. And, although our product is never going to be as fabulous as some of the things that can be made with vapor deposition technology, there's an awful lot, I think, that you can do with our technique where you're not spraying around the material and creating a huge recycling scenario. So I am optimistic that at least for some of the low-lying functions, we can move away from big single crystals, from vapor-based technology to something where it's much more local and is all encapsulated, less release into the environment, and sort of more efficient use of the materials. I'm an optimist, but that's what I hope.
As the efficient use of materials, has that been a theme in your research for a long time?
No. I started out as a thin film technology person, and it really wasn't until I discovered that we could, I wanted to study cylindrical silicon as a way to make solar cells. And then I found out that you could draw it as a fiber, and I got hugely excited. But that was really me looking for the answer to a particular problem and then finding out that it had much bigger implications.
What advances to optical fiber technology do you think are poised to take place in the near future? We'll say the next 5 to 10 years.
I think that this business of unconventional cores in fibers is I mean, right now it's a fairly small community, but it's growing really quite fast. And I think that not only semiconductors, but some of these multi-material cores where they, if you want to make contact to a device that's in a fiber, you just draw a metal wire in parallel with the semiconductor, and then you can use a laser to connect the two wherever you want. And so I think that using the optical fiber as a vessel for materials processing, I mean, that's the core of my research. So, of course, I think it's going to be interesting. But I think also you're going to see a lot of longer wavelength applications. I don't think that it's unreasonable to believe that there will be local power transmission, that, you can charge this, that, and the other locally using fibers to bring the signal or a power signal as well as an information signal. I think there's some really exciting stuff going on in sort of the equivalent of Anderson hopping, where you have modes that can go for longer than you would expect because you make a semi-random material. I think the optical fibers are going to be huge for the quantum world too. So
you mentioned the quantum world, and it's something that we've not only on the podcast but in our magazine, Photonics Spectrum magazine, we often discuss how do we cover quantum. I'd like to get your thoughts, your perspective on quantum and the potential there. It seems to be one of those realms that sort of works its way into multifaceted research. Has that been the experience for you?
So far, I think my experience counts as limited, but when you consider that the material systems that you have to work with, the geometries that you have to work with, the processing that you have to work with, the theory that you have to work with, and experimental design, it's sort of on a smaller scale, the same sort of complexity as we see with the Einstein telescope, the next gravity wave interferometer, perhaps. I don't think they've been given the award yet, but they've certainly got a proposal in. But, that we have found ourselves moving to projects where so many different skills are needed that whenever you talk about a big new initiative, you're really talking about involving many members of the community. Again, this idea that you have to include all sorts of different expertise.
How has the evolution of laser technology, that's another area we have yet to discuss here today, how has laser technology throughout the course of your career impacted your work?
Well, I was talking about those 40-year cycles. So it turns out that back, I don't know if it was 40 years, but, I started out pretty early on. I was using an excimer laser for making thin films, and I was using CO2 lasers to heat the substrates to cause sort of annealing during the processing. And so, these are things which have come back again. The excimer may be important for some of our next steps. The CO2 lasers are huge for processing these fibers that we're making. And I think that the availability of lasers of different wavelengths for characterization, that's been huge. And also the fact that they're now operable by people who come from different fields. That we can buy a fiber-coupled laser and a little controller, and then we can align that fiber and launch into these semiconductor core waveguides and do this without having a sort of 3-year internship to learn how to run the laser. That they have become simple tools.
I want to ask you about OSA and your time as president of OSA in 2019, and not being that far removed from your term as president. What are some of the lessons, the experience delivered in, and what also advice do you give to someone who might be an incoming president?
Well, serving as president of OSA was a huge honor, and having the opportunity to connect with students and researchers around the globe was a real eye-opener. To see the enthusiasm of optics professionals and students against the backdrop of incredibly varied conditions and opportunities, etc. And, connecting with colleagues through society events has also broadened my perspective in terms of industry's needs and going to rather a few more conferences than I typically had gone to in years prior. It really brought home to me the incredible power of this community that is coordinated through the society.
And to be sure, one of the I don't know if missions is the right word, but one of the core values of OSA is globalization, this global community, and broadening it. How has that expanded or advanced through your time in the field?
I think that sort of strangely enough, and I know that, it's nicer to stay away from the topic, but the pandemic has actually had a big influence because the move to online meetings and webinars and events and so on has meant that people can connect. If they're willing to keep odd hours for a few days, they can attend a conference on the other side of the world with no visa requirements, no airfare, and, participate meaningfully in an interaction. And, I think that seeing the way that people have connected has been extraordinary.
In looking back on the year 2020, amidst the challenges, the obstacles, the "this is new" attitude, how do you regard the year from a science perspective in terms of the progress that you and the community as a whole has been able to make?
I said I'm an optimist, and maybe I'm just very, very lucky, but I have been astounded at the enthusiasm, the keep it going, the positive attitude that I have encountered amongst my colleagues. And I think that there has been a real change of paradigm that, the video conferencing was something which, I don't know, the late 60s or early 70s, they tried having these televisions that you could talk to, and people went, oh, no, not doing that. But video conferencing has become socially acceptable, and people are learning how to make and continue collaborative relationships through this new medium. And I think that is going to impact for a long time the productivity of individuals going forward. I've seen, people, although there are interruptions in supply chains and equipment repair service is a little tricky these days, I've been really positively affected by how many people are out there and doing what they can and making do and moving forward.
Dr. Ursula Gibson has been our guest today on All Things Photonics. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We often talk with our All Things Photonics guests about startups, spin-out companies stemming from high-level research that aim to solve topical bottlenecks in the optics and photonics space through a product or products. Startups are not exclusive to photonics, though they play a role of increased prominence in advancing innovation in our field. It's especially true in supercomputing, where beyond quantum, silicon photonics is entrenched in the progress of compute. The material presents distinct advantages in chip-to-chip communication. More than this, as our next guest will discuss, in the area of compute, silicon and silicon photonics are highly amenable to the ability to increase bandwidth and, frankly, make computers better. We're joined now by Nick Harris, founder and CEO of Lightmatter, a photonics supercomputer company that has taken on that aforementioned challenge of making computers better. How you doing, Nick?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me.
So your approach here uses light, silicon photonics to be exact, and it's an approach that really does go beyond quantum. Can you get into this problem of heat that you are so well versed in? Introduce and explain that problem, and talk to me about why silicon as opposed to quantum.
So you hear a lot about Moore's law, and Moore's law describes that the number of transistors per unit area on a computer chip should double every 18 months. And there's a lot of companies out there trying to defend Moore's law and say it's not over. So I'm here to tell you that they're right. It's not over. The real problem is that when you shrink a transistor, it has to get more energy efficient. Imagine you're holding a computer chip and every 18 months you double that number of transistors. If they don't get more efficient, the chip gets hotter and hotter and hotter. So we've been in that situation for the past 15 years. The prediction that energy should drop with each node shrink is known as Dennard scaling. And that's really the issue today. So progress in computing and the performance of computer processors is really limited at this point by the ability of computer chip companies to remove heat using heat sinks, fans, water cooling, whatever techniques they can. So that's the bound that we've run into. And that's kind of the core problem for computers going forward. And it kind of motivates research into next generation computing platforms like the work we're doing with photonics for artificial intelligence, and also work in quantum computing.
So you do have a bit of a quantum background, but it's not so much that you're doing here with Lightmatter. Give me a rundown, a history of how Lightmatter came to be and what the focus of your work is now.
Yeah, so I did my PhD and a postdoc at MIT, where I was working on building quantum computers using silicon photonics. So there I was working on generating single photons, which are the qubit for a photonic quantum computer, doing processing on those quantum states, those qubits, and then detecting them with superconducting single photon detectors. So I spent a while doing that, and I think we were quite successful in demonstrating all of those components. But what became clear to me is that it was a very challenging problem to scale up the number of photonic qubits, and that there was some serious work that needed to be done, not just straightforward engineering, but perhaps some fundamental theoretical breakthroughs. And so having really worked hard on that problem, I realized that, I'd like to revisit quantum computing in about 10 or 15 years. And in the meantime, let's look at some more near-term applications of this computing technology. And so that's kind of the story behind how Lightmatter got started.
It's so key to startups, this consideration that once your feet are on the ground here, how can we be most practical and most efficient? How can we find the nearest term, most immediate and best uses for our offerings, for our product? And for you, that does involve silicon. We've talked about it already. And one of the things about silicon as a material is that it's so amenable to LiDAR, to sensing applications. Can you talk a little bit about why silicon and why that is the material focus here for your work now?
Yeah, it's really just about leveraging the infrastructure that traditional electronics have built up. So there are literally trillions of dollars invested in foundries that build silicon chips. It turns out that silicon is transparent in the same region as optical fibers, which are used for telecommunications. And you've got those two things together that make it a great platform for doing building optical systems, LiDAR sensing, computing like we're doing, and lots of other applications. So it's really just, it's not the best material for doing photonics, but it's one that's widely available, highly reliable from a manufacturing standpoint, very scalable and well understood. And I think those are the properties that make it the leader for doing large-scale photonic integration.
When you talk about powering smart computing, there are all these algorithmic advances too that are certainly on your radar and certainly pertinent. But one of the things that you mentioned here off camera, out of recording, is that the CMOS architecture and the CMOS infrastructure has really been vital to silicon and increasing its usability. How has that been so important to your work?
Yeah, I would say that what we're doing is only possible because over the past maybe 5 to 10 years, silicon photonics processing in standard CMOS foundries has become mainstream. So before that, what was happening is people were doing silicon photonics development at small foundries in countries like Singapore, where they're doing maybe 200 millimeter or smaller wafers. And this was a very kind of niche situation. You didn't have the maturity of the microelectronics market, where you call up TSMC, you have some amazingly complicated system to build, and they guarantee that they're going to deliver it with high yield on 300 millimeter wafers with low cost. And so over the past 5 to 10 years, that's kind of the state that we've gotten to with silicon photonics. Speaking of like TSMC, they're actually working on silicon photonics. There's also global foundries. It's really becoming mainstream, and it's that stability, high volume manufacturing, and sort of reliability of that supply chain that's really enabled the massive growth that you're starting to see in silicon photonics.
In the intro, we mentioned how vital chip-to-chip communication is and the role silicon photonics plays that way. There's a chip shortage, and it's been well documented. And you have a unique perspective from the platform of your current position. What's your take on the chip shortage, and how is it impacting the work that you're doing or trying to perform?
Yeah, so there are a lot of components that go into building computer chips. So imagine that you have a wafer. That wafer is going to get cut up into small chips, and those chips are going to get packaged. And a lot of the packages that you might build will use laminates and other technologies. And then those pieces go on to ultimately like a printed circuit board into a socket, and the printed circuit board has all sorts of components. So the picture I'm trying to paint is that there are a lot of pieces that go into building up compute and communications and even LiDAR components. And those components right now are in short supply. So, in terms of what we see at Lightmatter, there are components that we're interested in using that have 50-week lead times. It's kind of funny to talk about weeks in that scale, but it's like a year. And so you have to be really careful about timing your product announcements and releases. And it's a problem that I think the government is aware of. The Biden administration has been talking about really looking into that problem and trying to figure out what the limitations are and why we're currently at this point. But it's a challenging problem and something that needs to be worked out quickly.
Speaking with Nick Harris, he's founder and CEO of Lightmatter. And one of the other neat mentions that you've given me here is that you're increasing bandwidth, you're making computers better, and you're doing it without optical fibers. Why is that?
Yeah, so we're developing two products at Lightmatter. So we've built an optical computer. It's called Envise, and that product announcement will be happening next week, which is about the 9th, so March 9th. But we also have a new way for computer chips to talk to each other. And we invented that out of necessity. It just turns out that optical computers are so fast that standard protocols for communicating with chips are not going to be able to cut it. And so we developed a wafer scale optical interconnect. And what that means is that you can have many, many miniature waveguides in the space of a single optical fiber. That allows you to go a lot faster and use a lot less energy. When you look at packaging systems with optics inside, one of the principal costs is attaching optical fibers to those chips. And that's really the mainstream way that people are looking at connecting things up. With what we're doing, those waveguides are built into the platform. There's no fiber attach required, so it removes that packaging cost and complexity. And it really just enables ultra high speed communication between heterogeneous computer chips. So CPUs, GPUs, optical processors, memory, name your kind of chip. So that's something that's really important for us on our roadmap. And we think something that will enable a lot of high performance computing applications.
You mentioned that roadmap. What's horizontal for Lightmatter? Where's the company going, and what's next? Yeah, so we're announcing our products next week, and we're going to be announcing our optical compute platform for ultra high performance machine learning inference. The product's targeted at data centers, companies like Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, and so on. So that's kind of what we're working on right now. We're really excited to get that out into the market. It's been a pretty challenging tech development problem, but we're there and we're excited for people to try it. So it's this go-to-market motion that we're focused on right now. Well, congratulations on the developments. Keep up the good work, the hard work, and thank you so much, Nick, for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
That does it for this episode of All Things Photonics. Thank you to our engineer, Alan Shepard, and to Joel Williams with the news. Our featured music is courtesy of betterwithmusic.com. Most of all, thank you, our listeners. As always, you can share your thoughts, pitch us ideas, let us know how we're doing. You can reach us at allthings@photonics.com. All Things Photonics is available on all major platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as on our website. Subscribe, never miss an episode. I'm Jake Saltzman. This has been a Photonics Media production.